welcome to Planet Poet Words in Space on WIOX Community Radio. I'm your host, Sharon Israel, and I'm happy to welcome my guest, recent Poet Laureate of Orange County, New York, Robert Milby, who's with me by phone from Florida, New York, in the Hudson Valley. Hi, Robert.
Hello, Sharon.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm so happy you're on today. I'm going to read a little bit of your bio for everyone. Robert Milby, poet, teacher, and freelance thinker, was Poet Laureate of Orange County, New York from 2017 to 2019. Robert Milby's given over 500 featured readings and hosted 30 poetry series, including Calling All Poets in the Hudson Valley. He's been published in over 24 magazines and 25 anthologies, including Home Planet News, Chronogram, Waymark, and on many websites. His chapbook, Gothic Orange, Poems Inspired by Orange County, New York, was published through the County Historian's Office in October 2018. Robert Milby was a 2020 winner of the Wild West Poetry Contest, sponsored by Flying Monkey Productions in Kingston, New York. His latest collection, Corona d'Etat, The Pandemic Poems 2020, was published by Lion Autumn Music Publishing in 2021. And each October since 2003, a Milby and Ulster County, New York artist, Carl Weldon, haunt the Hudson Valley as the duo Theremin Ghosts. And Robert Milby lives in Florida, New York, in the Hudson Valley. So, Robert, it's a beautiful day in Roxbury, and I assume it's a beautiful day in Florida, New York?
It certainly is. It's rather cool here now.
Yeah, I know. It's. I hope it's not the beginning, early fall beginning. Would you start us off with a poem, please? Curator
Yes.
Wind?
Of course.
Thank you.
This is Curator Wind, First Presbyterian Church, Village of Florida, New York. Late February gales buffet and carry a senior crow as she attempts to land on the steeple of the Presbyterian Church, where shingles and boards have been pried away in weeping gusts. The sky is a colonial bed of wet gray blankets, mold-stained white paint peeled by storm anger. The bones are dark and damp, over 200 years old. We have prayed inside the mind of the building. Never have we observed the Curator Wind at his gallery of regret.
That's Robert Milby reading Curator Wind. That's a beautiful line. The sky is a colonial bed of wet gray blankets.
Thank you.
And it conveys the history and the difficult history. The bones are dark and damp.
Mm-hmm.
Poem has Florida, New York as a subject?
Well, it does. The reality is I'm inspired by small towns and villages as well as large cities. And the village of Florida, for many years, not as much now, but was known specifically for the agricultural community and also onions.
Really?
Yeah.
That was the main crop?
One of the main crops, and I think it was the main crop. But this particular church, you might find it amusing. I've never been inside the church. One morning, early, I think it was, 2020 in the winter, there was quite a storm. And I stood in the second floor of my house watching a crow attempting to land on the roof of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And he or she, it doesn't matter, but the crow couldn't do it because the winds were so excessive. It wasn't a storm. It was just heavy, a storm of wind, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And that was basically the inspiration for the poem.
It's such a poet's viewpoint. There's this tiny little thing that happens. It has such import.
Yeah, it's funny because the area is relatively flat, and it seems to channel wind, at least over the last few decades, it seems.
And I'm fascinated that you were Poet Laureate of Orange County.
Yes.
How does one become Poet Laureate?
Well, in this county, it's a relatively recent experience. I think that it had started, the call first went out in 1997 by then County Executive Joe Rampey, if I remember correctly. And there really haven't been that many But to become a poet laureate, once the call goes out, however one would receive or perceive the request, they would obviously contact however it's being reported, whether it's nowadays it's the county historian. But I think there was an arts council effort. Nevertheless, a person who feels that they're able to fulfill, it's a civic post, so they would have to fulfill a series of suggestions and requirements. A formal application process, I would imagine, I'm not aware of it because I never applied formally. I had spoken to the county historian who had asked me. She was Johanna Jan. She was interested in starting up the position, looking for applicants, and my name went around, and I said yes, but then about a week later it was formally announced.
That's lovely.
Yeah, it was fairly easy.
What were your duties? It is kind of formidable, even in a regional laureate position, I would imagine.
We have only I shouldn't say only, but we have 62 counties in New York State, and not every county has a poet laureate position. But largely, I should say specifically, the duties were to bring poetry to the people and encourage the reading of poetry and the reading of contemporary poets, as well as the obvious historical greats. And I also got several chances to work with children in writing workshops.
Wonderful.
It was great. In an historic village called Museum Village, which is in Monroe, New York. A lot of the duties were suggested, but I basically made my own schedule. I have a lot of experience hosting poetry readings and teaching creative writing workshops.
Was it a bit of a life changer in a way? It must have been.
Yes, it was. It opened a few doors to experiences with people who may not have thought much of poetry or had much experience with poetry. And as a contemporary poet, I'm fortunate to know a lot of people involved in the arts here in Orange County and obviously beyond.
Yeah, that's a thrilling thing to introduce a person to poetry, and they realize that, wow, I can read this. This is meaningful to me. It's not some esoteric business from a different planet, you know?
Yeah, that's true.
Robert, would you read another poem for us?
I will. This one it might require just a note of background.
Please.
But this is from Corona d'Etat, the Pandemic Poems, and this is about the famous mummy called the Iceman. And specifically, after the mummy was found in a glacier, I think it was between Austria and Italy, there was also a conflict. It's one of the oldest mummies ever found. And they had called it after a glacier, specific glacier, Etsi, or Otzi, if you will. So this is even Etsi had a corona for the Iceman. The Iceman had a corona, COVID-19 BC version. He had Lyme, sores, consumption, bowel problems, and genital warts. He herded sheep and stepped in dung, breathed smoke and campfire emphysema. Etsi was sick from eating pork and curing beef, went vegan in snow before alpine meadows prepared his spring salads. He had no tribal medical insurance, for shamans worked overtime during lean winter months. He walked with an arrowhead stuck in his back. In his isolation, he used dried herbs and made clothes, ate mushrooms. His parents had the nerve to prepare for the coming warmth. Etsi wore the crown of survival, which makes our endless crying trivial.
That's great. That's Robert Milby reading his poem, Even Etsi Had a Corona. And we may be like Etsi in a few decades. Who knows?
Well, we'll see.
Depending more on shamans than we know, that we anticipate. I really like the line, went vegan in snow before Alpine Meadows prepared his spring salads. It's got a nice ironic tone to it, but it's quite serious. He walked with an arrowhead stuck in his back. For some reason, that seems to be the center of the poem.
Well, it's fundamentally perceiving through fact and fiction his survival, and he didn't live very long. I think he had died in his 30s or 40s. But he appeared to have been something of a warrior, which was common in his day. This is 4,000 years ago, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And it is true about the arrowhead. A piece of it stuck in his back from fighting, obviously, and they were able to find out some of his last meals through forensic, I should say, investigation or even experimentation. But it's a fascinating, and some of the diseases mentioned he probably had. So
right.
To me, it was deeply fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm interested in archaeology.
And the connection between us all of those long years ago.
Yes.
Would you talk about the title of your latest collection, Corona d'Etat?
Yeah, it's a tricky title. It's Corona d'Etat, lifted from the French phrase
coup d'etat?
Coup d'etat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was trying to remember how to say it, which obviously was a revolutionary, if not militaristic phrase.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea here was that we were going to be struggling and fighting against this pathogen. And so the collection, just as a word of caution, it's a very political and very specific collection which covers many different bases regarding contemporary American life and the lives of people around the planet. But there's a lot of taking leaders to task or holding them responsible for words. So this is fundamentally about words and expression.
It's a beautiful title. It has a lot of internal Corona d'Etat. It has a internal resonance with the similar vowels.
That's right.
Yeah, I like that. Robert,
yes.
When did you start writing this book? It was during the pandemic, correct?
Well, yeah, it was around the first week. I was trying to understand an onslaught of media, radio, television, etc., media sources that had attempted to set some sort of a foundation of explanation, and also my own fear, my own concern, my worry for my family, and for other people, for friends and colleagues and so on. It was turning out to virtually a poem a day for a while.
Right. It was sort of like writing notes to yourself and then making the poems.
Mm-hmm. That's a good way to put it. And there's a lot of literary allusions and quotations that work. I quote a lot of poets from the historical record and from contemporary writers as well in attempting to understand the scope of it.
Mm-hmm. And has it affected your style, your process in writing the pandemic itself?
That's a great question. It was, I hope this doesn't surprise anyone, but it was an interruption in my typical writing form of, I like to write a lot about nature and about perceptions of the natural world. And for everyone it was an interruption, but for me it became an immediate inspiration. So that's the origin of that.
You write beautifully about nature, and I was wondering if you would read your poem For the Daisies. It's not pandemically associative, I don't think. Am I wrong? But it's quite,
you're correct.
It's quite beautiful.
Thank you. It's funny because, Sharon, this is a recent poem, and I'm fond of a lot of poets, contemporary and from the UK, and this is by contemporary poet. This quotation, Kathleen Jamie, from her great poem, Daisies, rather. This is, "We are flowers of the common sward. That much we understand." And this is for the daisies. "Late May was in love with June. We stood as maids of honor, witnesses to their wedding. Sparrows fed their young, seeds of hornbeam blossoms. Robins foraged for worms and grubs. Blue Jay was best man, and squirrels prepared the lawns. Honey was a gift from the barn's apiary. Clover and roses, a prenuptial agreement, as new salads from the garden were served to mouths, beaks, and maws. Dandelions, the children's flower, agreed to cast the softest confetti. Daisies, in their shy beauty, from farm fields and roadsides, backyards and marshes, graveyards and rail trails, whispered the poetry of impending summer.
That's lovely. For the Daisies, read by poet Robert Milby, reading his own poem. And it's a personification poem, I think. But it's even sort of more than that. We're observing, but we stood as maids of honor. Late May was in love with June. I like that.
Thank you.
That's so good. And that's a very lyric poem. Can you talk about lyricism in your poetry?
Well, it's not always conscious.
Mm-hmm.
I listen to a lot of different kinds of music, but I also read a lot of lyrical poetry from the past, when poetry often had different forms than we are typically used to using now. The lyricism in this piece is carried by not only the images, but by alliteration and some of the poetic tools that we often use once the poem is near completion. We don't always start out with the idea of plugging in certain poetic tools.
Mm-hmm.
It usually evolves that way. But the lyricism also is my own personal love story with nature, with animals and wildlife, specifically the landscapes of the Hudson Valley.
Yeah, that's very apparent in the poem. And when you say backyards and marshes, graveyards and rail trails, so you put the human in there.
I do, and there's a duality involved here: the light and the dark, the contrast to the mystery and the tangible reality that we perceive through the five senses.
Mm-hmm. I've been thinking about form lately. This poem is 3 lines, 3 stanzas. The first one 3 lines, and the last 2 4 lines. And I think form needs to reflect or echo or mean the content of the poem, whatever that means, whatever the content is. The form should serve the poem.
It should. It should serve as a not just a foundation, but a scaffolding with which to work.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that once again, the more poetry that a person is exposed to, the more they're willing to take a chance with, and it starts to become a natural way of understanding, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you. You're also very interested in music. Are you a musician?
Or? No, not at all.
Okay.
I wish.
And you are interested in classical music and
very much.
Yeah. And what is it about? I noticed you like the period, the Impressionists, the French Impressionists, and the music from the turn of the 20th century.
Well, the answer is yes and no. It will surprise you. I technically go back in interest to the medieval period, but I find myself in the spring and summer listening to a lot of Impressionists. I'm not sure exactly why. There's a certain pastel and landscape flavor to it.
The softness of the weather, perhaps, that
I think so.
Influences.
And one of I listen to all of the Impressionists, but one that I find particularly inspiring is Eric Satie. And I had been, with this next poem, had been sitting in my writer's garret with the screens in the window, and I heard a lot of noise in the street, and it fully interrupted the CD that I was listening to. So this is Beyond Satie. Beyond Satie, I hear yelling in the street, just after opening the second-floor windows to a May morning, expecting sparrows to speak from Rose of Sharon. Nocien is shattered by an unseen stranger slamming a car door. Beyond the CD's vernal outpouring, other people's schedules, louder than a rural morning in 1890, come not to my door as an angry ode to frenetic urban dance, but through the window, stealing the breath of a bohemian piano, where the blundering offspring of entertainment's plot against inspiration tramples gardens, scatters birds, and fells trees beyond poetry, beyond Satie.
That's great. That's Robert Milby reading Beyond Satie. And, of course, the juxtaposition of the urban environment and the one in which Satie lived. But I guess if you asked Satie, he would say, "Oh, it used to be so quiet where I lived, and now it's too noisy. Well, the trains and what have you.
Yeah,
You know."
that's right.
But I like stealing the breath of a bohemian piano. I like what you do when you infuse, when you animate the inanimate. I think it's very successful.
Thank you. That is specifically for him, because Satie had a very eccentric and bohemian life. Not
Yes.
that artists and composers naturally don't, but he was particularly unusual.
I heard that he never changed his clothes.
Well, I don't know. That may be.
He had like 2 suits for like 40 years, but maybe that's apocryphal.
I don't know.
Could you explain what the gnocines are? Am I not pronouncing that?
The gnocine?
Yeah. Yes.
Well, I don't speak French, but I tried to learn how to say it. It's a type of compositions. They were fairly original and radical on Satie's part. And we're talking about the 1880s into the I think the mid-90s. I'm not exactly sure. There were about 6 of them, if I remember correctly. Now, this might surprise you, but for me, they're such a mood-enhancing and a mood-altering experience, because some of them sound very forlorn, as if a storm is hanging over the sky, or even autumnal, which is kind of fascinating.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, when there's no time signatures, well, they're first ones. It's sort of like Cézanne really played with form and was a precursor to abstraction in art. I think Ravel and Satie, they stretched everything and played with that, and all the silence within the pieces that Satie especially did in his piano works.
I agree.
Can be a harbinger for people like John Cage and etc. It's all very interesting, I find.
Yeah, there's such an interconnectedness. I will say for the listeners that one thing I found particularly exciting was that he somehow knew, I don't know if they were friends or colleagues, but Claude Debussy. They knew each other. And I didn't know that in the beginning, because I've been enjoying Debussy for years. And Satie is about the last 5 years I really began to play his music over and over.
It's very hypnotic.
Exactly
It
so.
really
That's
is.
a good way to put it.
But you are involved with music, with your October haunting with Carl Weldon, because the theremin goes. The theremin is a very peculiar instrument that it sort of stands alone. Could you describe it a little bit?
Well, I think that the founder, the inventor, Leo Theremin, I think that was his name. I'm not sure what the exact purpose was. It's such a strange instrument. But the irony is, I shouldn't say irony. One thing that's fascinating is the fact that it's used and has been used not only in experimental music and expression, but also in classical music, which is really fascinating. And one day, this is funny. I like to write a lot of Gothic and ghostly poetry. And an old friend of mine, Carl Weldon, who is multi-talented, I had asked him, I said, Carl, would you be interested in playing your Moog theremin while I read ghost poetry this October at Mud Puddle Cafe in New Paltz? He lives pretty close to the cafe, about 5 miles away. And he said, okay. So it evolved, not just Carl framing the poems and the sounds, the often frightening and eerie sounds of the theremin, but it evolved into a show. And we've been doing it for many years, since 2003.
That's great. And the thing about the theremin, which is so bizarre, I mean, it's an electronic instrument, is that you don't touch it.
Right.
It's sort of like, what's the Reiki?
Reiki.
Yeah.
That's a good way to put it.
It's like musical Reiki.
I never thought of it that way, but yeah, it's like that. And there's a funny, it's odd, but we really play up the eccentricity, because not only is it right before Halloween, sometimes on Halloween, but we play around the Hudson Valley, and all of the ghost and Gothic poems and prose poems, they're all original. I've written all of them, and Carl usually starts with a small lecture about the history of the theremin. And the irony and the comedy is that I have never tried it, never.
Really?
Yeah, I've never touched it.
You keep in your own corners.
That's exactly it.
Hysterical. That's wonderful. You're listening to Planet Poet Words in Space. I'm your host, Sharon Israel, here with poet Robert Milby. And now bringing the latest poetry news and the latest in poetic insights is Planet Poets Poet at Large, poet and visual artist Pamela Moshe Pierce, joining us by phone from Manhattan. Hi, Pamela.
Hello, Sharon. Hello, Robert.
Hello, Pamela.
Pamela has a different prism of her bio every month. So I'm just going to say, Pushcart Prize nominee poet Pamela Moshe Pierce is engaged in a major effort to move inventory from her files to publication. Isn't that the story of all of our lives?
It is, and that's what I'm doing right now. So I have a lot of work out, and as I said, let's see when I do the next show. Let's hope that I have some good news.
Yes, best of luck.
Some acceptances, all right?
Yes.
Well, I'm so happy to be here today, and it's very funny, Robert, as I was listening to your bio read by Sharon, I felt, oh, man, there is so much, and I'm going to give you some competition because I'm going to be talking about Picasso. Who also has, I want to talk a little bit about Picasso's poetry, which I was introduced to this by Sharon, and I've taken off on this in my mind. I've been really excited by what I have been finding, and I know about him as an artist, and I know that he was in every movement. He was in Cubism, Surrealism, Expressionism, Post-Impressionism, Neoclassicism, Synthetic Cubism, Naive Art, Realism, Impressionism, Symbolism, and Art Nouveau.
Oh, my goodness.
He invented the collage with Braque and Gris, and he also, his work included painting, sculpture, ceramics, printmaking, drawing, assemblage, and theater design. He also decided to study singing at one point, which didn't go very well.
Oh, I would give a lot of money to hear Picasso sing.
Well, it didn't go very well. So at the age of 53 in 1935, he decided he began to write poetry. And I love this quote from his mother in a letter that she wrote to him, and this is what she said, quote, "They tell me that you write. I can believe anything about you. If one day they tell me that you say Mass, I shall believe it just the same." End quote.
Oh, wow.
So they knew about him. They knew he was going to try anything. And what prompted Picasso, I found this very interesting, that what prompted him to begin writing poetry is what prompts many people to write poetry, and it was loss.
Oh, yes.
And I know this from my own life and from writing workshops that I have given where people are drawn to them because of a great loss, either divorce or death of someone close to them. And in Picasso's case, his wife left him. And he was devastated by this, not only emotionally, but because there was huge financial consequence for him.
It was also, excuse me for interrupting, the only time I think anybody ever left him.
I think later on, François Gillot did leave him. So there really are two women in his life who left him. But this one, Olga, his first wife, they never divorced. She died in 1954, and then he went on to marry again. So he only was married twice in his life, although it seems like he's had many, many wives. So this really did it to him, and he began to write at the age of 35. And then he wrote every single day of his life until 1958. So he was very committed to it. And I'd like to read you the first entry in his poetry diary.
Oh, great.
"If I should go outside, the wolves would come to eat out of my hand, just as my room would seem to be outside of me. My other earnings would go off around the world, smashed into smithereens. But what is there to do today? It's Thursday. Everything is closed. It's cold. The sun is whipping anybody. Askew, how great this year has been for putting in preserves like these and thus and so and always things are being left behind. So these are very free-form poems. There's no punctuation, basically no punctuation. It's very stream of consciousness.
Pamela, did he say the walls are eating out of my hand?
The wolves are eating out of my hand.
The wolves. Oh.
Yes.
Oh.
Okay.
So it's interesting that he puts this, the opening lines of this, and it's, really tells you, it tells you what you need to know.
Yeah, definitely. It says a lot about Picasso.
It says a lot about Picasso and how profound this loss is for him, and how he feels that he's being, really taken in this situation, in addition to the heartbreak of it.
Yes.
It's good.
And what goes on is he progresses in his poetic life. We begin to see, or I begin to see, we all do that. He uses words as a palette. He calls it a palette of moving colors. And here's another early poem, which is part of an excerpt. Now, this is one of my absolute favorites. Listen in your childhood to the hour that white in the blue memory borders white in her very blue eyes, and piece of indigo sky of silver, the white traverse cobalt, and white paper that the blue ink tears out bluish. Its ultramarine descends, that white enjoys blue repose, agitated in the dark green wall green that writes its pleasure, pale green rain that swims yellow green.
Oh man, that's amazing.
So it's so painterly. It's totally painterly, and he's swimming in Paris at the time in the creme de la creme of literary society with Gertrude Stein and Hemingway and Cocteau and all of those. And he keeps writing and he keeps writing. And one of the things that he says, he's a true surrealist. He says he doesn't want to tell stories or describe sensations. He wants the words to become the sensations, and he wants them to express it that way.
Yes,
and he wants to break down the distinction between thought, writing, and visual imagery, which he does. And he
certainly does
very, very well.
It reminds me of Charles Bernstein, as one of the language poet founders, is that it transcends words. It's the experience on the page, and it's very Gertrude Steinian too. So he really was a good student of that time.
He was a perfect student of that time and of surrealism. And one of the other things that I think is very important is that his work is very difficult we use the word accessible now, and his work was not accessible. His work is not accessible, and it's very difficult for a common reader to understand this poetry of his, as his paintings. But as we all have done this, you spend time with it, these elements seem to click. And you see that each subject will relate to the one next to it as colors affect, each color affects the one next to it, and that the words are either connected with connotation or some kind of phonetic foundation. So you have to spend time with both his visual art and his poetry.
It's an interconnectedness.
There's an interconnectedness, and it's not obvious, but it's absolutely there. And I like to read an excerpt from the last entry in 1959, and you see how he has evolved. Okay.
Please.
There leave 2 trucks to hose the bull ring down, and slap bang in the middle, a roustabout comes on a butterfly stuck with a pin on a wine cork on strands of electrical wiring. Puffing away on a bagpipe out in the wheat field already mowed. The women, and they are stripping the women and cutting up like confetti the monks, lashed to the strings of raw sausages. The little schoolgirls are rushing and whistling and lashed to the wheels of the truck.
Unbelievable. You can have a cartoonist just meld one image into the next.
Yeah.
Right.
It's interesting.
And there's a lot of his work that I could not read on the air today because he's very, very interested in subjects that are not up for this radio show.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. You know, one of Robert's poems, For the Daisies, you have dandelions, the children's flower, agreed to cast the softest confetti.
Yes, and there you go.
Picasso.
And there you go. So this was a great adventure for me today, Sharon. And I'm going to end with one statement. You know, his translator who translated all these excerpts and an editor who put a collection together says this: Picasso, like any poet of consequence, is a man fully into his time and into the terrors that his time presents. They reflect the state of things between the two world wars, the first one still fresh in the mind, and rumblings of the second starting up, a time and place where poetry becomes, for him, as for us, the only language that makes sense.
Oh, that's great.
Isn't that a beautiful line?
Wonderful.
It's pungent.
Wonderful.
I know.
That's Pamela Moshe Pierce, Planet Poets, Poet at Large, bringing us her marvelous insights on Picasso. Thank you, Pamela.
Thank
That
you.
was great.
Thank you.
I had a great time, and I'm going to enjoy the rest of the show.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye. And Robert, it's interesting, as Pamela was saying about a poet is of his time, and your next poem is I Was Never Under Quarantine.
Oh.
And that's, your poems are really of their time now. It's easy or hard or in between to write when something is happening. It's a very different thing to write during the pandemic and to write in reflection of the pandemic. So you were able to do that.
Yes, it puts the writer, the artist, right in the center of all of it, and you have this swirl of sensations and information and tactile responses that become hard to deal with. And poetry is a language that we can use and find comfort in.
Mm-hmm. And find meaning in, and which can anchor people in ways that the reader will not expect to be anchored.
Yes, there's a
sense of things.
A waking up. And we all in our day-to-day lives have so many distractions, and for the waking up effort that I had hoped to put into this book, I'm continuing it. There's a second volume in which 47 poems thus far have been composed since January of this year.
Mm.
Yeah.
Wow. Would you read I Was Never Under Quarantine?
Of course, thank you. This is I Was Never Under Quarantine. In the haze of selling their future, several generations have forgotten the banker's caste system. I never bowed to worship money, nor sang in corporate cages. I was not sick beyond disgust with modern sages, psychic jails and lockdowns, screwing planks in stages. There were times that I was knocked down, but I was never under quarantine. State by state, the whiteout scent of cooking books without burning in a bonfire, a source of bankers' lies on tiny screens and glowing monitors. I never dressed in surgeon's drag, walking through the streets where people clapped for nurses' burqas or stared like dolts and preached. There are times when I'm knocked down, but I am never under quarantine. Without modesty, states stand in as teacher, mother, and father, techno-gods of a new order. I wandered field and forest, drove a city lane. Not once did cries of misery cause me bare-faced shame. I never paid a jailer, I never bought the myths concocted by a dark regime in estates of cards and sticks. There were times when they knocked me down, but I was never under quarantine. Entire countries are not hospitals, nor landscapers' motor pools. Fearful counties darkened churches, ignored the children, and locked their schools. Lectured in public by strangers whose intents remain the same as past regimes' deceptions and themes of costume dramas. We were never under quarantine unless we gave consent, masked and gloved, cold penitents, or domestic spies and dissidents.
That's Robert Milby reading his poem, I was never under quarantine. And could you explain what that means, actually? You were never held down?
Meaning that the freedom of thought, of self-expression, of finding comfort in one's own private moments, of choosing to question everything that was, and the information was incredible, it still is, that was heading to each person on the entire planet, really. It's an irony of uniting people in a cause that people never expected to unfold. So there's a certain level of intimate analysis and intimate meditation that I feel that is important, especially when there are crises. And this, of course, is a global crisis.
Right. And this is not the age of consent. It needs to be so. And so you approach the micro and the macro at the same time, because they're the same.
Yep.
You have to, it's each individual coming to terms with what they need to come to terms with.
There's also a self-awareness in confronting fear and confronting ignorance oneself, to be able to stand up and say, I'm not going to hide away from the people I love and friends and colleagues and nature and the reality of this short life that we all have on this planet. To hide away is not productive. I mean, we all want to hide away at times.
It's a difficult thing. It's against human nature to do so.
Exactly.
And sometimes it needs to be done, but what can I say? There's no solution for this, and it keeps changing.
It does.
There's evolution of this virus in front of us, and it's like riding a surfboard with the wave never stopping. It's very difficult. It's very hard. But you did win an award for this poem. Could you tell us about the contest?
Well, it was a surprise because there's a tiny press called Flying Monkey Press or Production.
Great name.
Yeah, it really is. This is a poet from, a friend of mine from many years, a poet from Kingston, New York, Cheryl Rice.
Oh, I know Cheryl. She's been on the show. Yeah.
Oh, I had no idea.
She's wonderful.
That's great.
Yeah.
Oh, definitely so. I've known her for 26 years, I think. And she had sent this out, this call for submissions. She was running a contest, and I thought, that was odd. And I sent work in, and I didn't expect anything, but here it was that this poem won, but also there was an honorable mention that I took as well, which I thought was, pretty wild. And for me, it's all about grassroots, so that was part of the reason that I had sent the work, and part of the reason why I took the chance in having this published, the book itself, because it's controversial, but also it reaches to the grassroots element, and it works around tensions, and, hey, this is a different way to look at something.
Yeah, and it rhymes. A lot of it rhymes. You have a lot of end rhymes.
Oh, yeah. That was deliberate, actually.
And why did you do that? I mean, it gives a certain nostalgic feel to a very contemporary poem.
Well, it's a calling out, and it is a somewhat of a preacher mentality, a self-awareness, a standing up for oneself and the people that each person loves and cares about, and hopefully encouraging people to see things in a way that they might not have considered. If we only operate as a result of fear, then we become paralyzed. So this is about self-awareness and also self-worth, I think.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I wanted to say that that you've been reading your poetry since March 1995 in various places, including the Hudson Valley, New York City, Long Island, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. And you've given so many readings and been in front of the poetry crowds for so long. It's hard to say what your favorite venue is. You don't want to insult anybody, right?
Oh.
You don't say. But do you have any tips for poets for when they read, how to structure reading or what to do briefly?
Oh, definitely so. One of my favorite venues is the Howland Cultural Center in Beacon, New York. And there are several, there have been several poetry series there. The current one is called the Hudson Valley Poets. It's still to a degree on hiatus, but they're filming poets to read for YouTube for now. It's about ready to reopen soon. fundamentally, well, I'd say that start out with writing about nature. Every human being, even if you're living in a very crowded city that's dusty and dirty, you still encounter nature. So I would suggest, if you ever have writer's block, to write about nature, write about family, write about the weather. It's often very, very easy to start. And also, when it comes to public readings, as a featured poet, I'm over 500, but when it comes to open mics and hosting poetry readings, I've been on stage for over 2,000 times.
That sounds exhausting.
It can be. It can be at certain times of the year. Obviously, not for the last year because there was a lot of postponements. But now that things are opening up, little by little, people are taking some chances safely and intelligently. There's also a way to encounter new people coming in off the street, and that is to wave them in and right, come on in and share whatever you have. And we all learn from each other, and we find inspiration. So it's one thing the only complaint that I have is the whole volume issue. Speak up, speak up.
Oh dear.
Yeah, but it's okay. As a host now since September of '95, I'm constantly hoping to encourage people. It's about finding, to quote Carl Weldon, find your voice, and it's that's a little performance piece that he does to much acclaim. And it's relevant, and I think every human being has a voice, and we also can learn from each other. So it comes down to feeling confident, and as you write more and as you read more poets, so poetry coming from history, coming from contemporary poets, and we all learn. That's one of the best ways to learn outside of a classroom.
Right. And you are a teacher, too. You've been an instructor.
Independent teacher. Yeah, I'm not a certified teacher, but I teach creative writing workshops. I encourage people that way. I'm constantly critiquing people's work. And when it comes to the actual craft, I've taught probably quite a few workshops over the years. And I have a lot of people sending me work regularly, so that's a form of teaching.
Yes, that's great. You know, we are running out of time. The show went very fast. Would you read one more poem of your choice?
I will. Thank you. All right. This is another one about classical music, but it was a concert that I had, a woman and I had gone on a date, and it was at Pacham Terrace, which is an outdoor sculpture garden here in the Warwick, New York area, and peace on earth, obviously. So this is Pacham Terrace. At Pacham Terrace. The Weweyunda Creek spoke verses to July's dog days, as the chamber organ tuned and patrons waited to enter the remains of the old water mill. A woman wandered the sculptures. Her red blouse bespoke summer flower gardens, and her smile reversed time. She had not heard Theorbo nor Viola da Gamba, but past lives are often forgotten in the new world beneath the sun. Ancient river beckoned, and we surveyed the grand cave of the mill, where Italy met England over 400 years ago. The trees whispered tales of eldritch people, ghosts watching in approval. The woman sat in awe of holy music, noble, untroubled, and at peace.
That's lovely. That's Robert Milby reading his poem At Pacham Terrace. I love she had never heard Theorbo or Viola da Gamba, which are two ancient instruments.
Yes.
And how past lives are also often forgotten in the new world beneath the sun. Well, thank you so much for sharing your poetry with us and your thoughts about poetry and your life. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you, Sharon. This has been a pleasure.
And thank you, Pamela Moshe-Pierce, for your insights on Picasso today. And thank you all for listening.